Hey,
Oh, that's new.
that's new. All right, so I think it's time for us to begin. Hello again. My name is Lily Filler, and I am president of the Jewish Historical Society of South Carolina. I want to thank you all so much for joining us on our successful programming, Sunday Conversations, headed up by the Honorable Richard Gergel and Charleston attorney Robert Rosen. I would also like to introduce everyone to our executive director, Rachel Barnett, who is responsible for most of the logistics involved in all of our programming. It has been about 7 weeks since we had our last program in May. It seems like an eternity, and I really miss seeing you all. So welcome back again. We welcome you to all of our programs and hope you will continue to join us on Zoom. Please become a member of the Jewish Historical Society of South Carolina by going to our website, jhssc.org. As a reminder, this session will be recorded and will be available later on in the week for previewing. In order to limit interruptions, I ask you again, please mute yourself and stay muted during the presentation. We welcome questions through the chat room. Please send them to me, Lily Filler, and I will consolidate them and ask the speakers at the appropriate time. This program is one in a series of programs of the Jewish Historical Society of South Carolina that is dedicated to the studying, preserving, promoting, and awareness of history and culture of the Jews of South Carolina. This week is the first of 2 programs on the topic, South Carolina Jews and the Law. The next program on this same topic will be on July 25th. Mark your calendars now. Today's program will concentrate on the lawyers from the early history of South Carolina through World War II. South Carolina has a distinguished history of judges and lawyers, and the Jewish community played a huge role on the rule of law. I also welcome today the Honorable Jean Toll, Chief Justice of the South Carolina Supreme Court, and I turn the program over now to Judge Richard Gergel, who will introduce our friend and guest and start the program. Go ahead, Richard.
Thank you, Lily. It is great to be back with our friends again. You know, when we were discussing topics, Robert and I assumed that when we got to the issue of Jews and the law, this would be a cakewalk for us. We thought we knew everything, and this would be something that with a little minimal preparation, we would be able to do this program. Well, we were in for some surprises. Number one, we didn't know that much. As we got into it, we discovered we knew very little about this subject. And secondly, we were surprised to learn no one else had done much work on this subject. So here we were running around attempting to do original research for this program. And thank goodness for Rachel Barnett, our executive director, who became a partner with us as we chased around this information and this wonderful PowerPoint you will see in just a few minutes as we go through the program. Rachel prepared, we've been gathering photographs, we've been gathering original research. And Robert, you and I have got to write something about this just to preserve what we've pulled together. So is there any ambitious scholar out there? This is a great subject to write something on. Robert and I are too exhausted to do any more writing right now. So someone else needs to do that. Let me, first of all, I'm pleased that my good friend, retired Chief Justice Jean Toll is joining us for this program. I don't see Jean. Jean, can you hear me okay? I don't see you on my screen.
I can hear you, and you are on the screen right next to me, Richard, and
Great.
array that I have of all the folks that are participating.
Well, great. You know, it's fully appropriate that Jean and I would do this together because for over 20 years, we did history programs together in an organization called the Supreme Court Historical Society. And we would do these programs, and then we would get all the people who participated to contribute to articles, and we published multiple books from USC Press, and people call me all the time and thank us. There was one on the early African-American bar, one on women in the law, We did religious freedom in South Carolina, and we did Judge Jay Watus Waring and his important contributions to civil rights law in South Carolina. So as Robert and I wandered into this webcast, I had to drag my friend Jean Toll along with us here. And she's going to join us to talk a bit as we get along into this a bit, both about the early Jewish women lawyers, and as we wound out the program, about the huge impact of Professor Coleman Karish of the USC Law School, 40 years plus as a professor who played a huge role in this large number of Jewish lawyers in South Carolina, and also just he was a beloved, revered figure. And Jean was taught by him, as was Robert's father, Morris. So it's really quite a story of Professor Karish, and he deserves all the attention. But let me first, Robert, let's go to you and let's talk a little bit about, we asked the question, you and I didn't know, who was the first Jewish lawyer in South Carolina?
Yeah, this is really difficult because apparently from everything we've been able to read, the law was not highly regarded in early colonial and early national South Carolina. And so it didn't look like that many Jewish lawyers were that involved in. But one of the things that's interesting is, and this is where the people from Charleston have to always wake up and realize we're not the only people in the state. Georgetown had a very, substantial, very active Jewish community. And they had a number of mayors, and it looks like before the 19th century, like in the 18th century, there were only 3 states that even allowed Jews to even practice law. So that would have been South Carolina, Georgia, and Pennsylvania. Somebody one day will have to figure out why that is. But the first Jewish attorney that we've been able to locate in South Carolina was Moses Myers of Georgetown, 1793, followed by his brother Abraham
Myers.
1796, Georgetown. And then Moses Myers apparently didn't enjoy practicing law that much, so he became the Georgetown clerk of court from 1798 to 1817. And his brother was elected mayor of Georgetown, 1826 to 27. And as Richard's pointed out, here are Jewish people living in the late 18th century at a time when not only were Jews not lawyers in Europe, the ghetto in Venice was probably still going, and Jews were living in ghettos. They certainly couldn't vote. And here they are as lawyers in early Georgetown, South Carolina.
And Robert, not just lawyers, once the clerk of court and once the mayor.
Right. So, and then, so we kind of what we've stumbled onto is there's a story of early Georgetown, which we don't know very much about. And there's also a story about Sumter, which we'll get to a little later. So, there were Jewish lawyers in antebellum Charleston. Abraham Moise. My guess is we probably got 10 or 15 lawyers named Moise, and some of them even have the same name, Edwin Warren Moise. We know at least 2 and probably 3 people with that name, and so the Moise family is everywhere. Sumter, Charleston. They moved
New Orleans,
Columbus, Georgia. So a lot of these Charleston lawyers end up moving. When the South in the early national period, 1800s, people moved to Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana to seek their fortune, and a lot of Jewish Charlestonians and South Carolinians went with them, which leads us to Richard.
Yes, Chapman Levy. Chapman Levy lived between Columbia and Camden. He owned the brickworks in Columbia. If anyone knows the Hebrew Benevolent Society Cemetery in Columbia, the De Leon Cemetery, which is the older interior part of the cemetery, that brickwork is almost certainly from Chapman Levy's brickyard. Well, he is he becomes a member of the bar in 1806, and he practices law with a guy named Willie in Camden. So McWillie. And he and McWillie are the best of friends. I think McWillie married one of Chapman Levy's sisters or something like that. There's definitely a family relationship. And McWillie is in the South Carolina House and Senate. And then he moves, as Robert mentions, his move to Mississippi. Go west, young man. He goes to Mississippi. Chapman Levy takes his Senate seat. He is in the 1830s. He's in the state Senate in South Carolina. Again, as Robert's mentioned, this Jewish office holding around the country is not that common. Here is this Jewish state senator from Camden. He is a big Jacksonian Democrat, and he is in correspondence with Andrew Jackson. I jokingly have referred to Chapman Levy as the Isidore Lurie of the 1830s. I mean, he is a player in South Carolina politics. Well, in the late 1830s, he does not run for re-election. He moves to Mississippi with his friend and law partner, McWillie, and McWillie gets elected governor of Mississippi. I mean, this is a very interesting group. Another thing about Chapman Levy, and this is kind of on the theme that these guys are sort of larger than life. I think it's true both for the early male Jewish lawyers and the Jewish women attorneys. This guy is the state's expert on dueling. Who ever heard of a Jew expert on dueling? People who would have a duel would schedule appointments, and he would be consulted on the techniques of dueling. It's just another one of these sort of characters. He was a veteran of War of 1812. He was a substantial figure, and one of the early Jewish lawyers, really the third Jewish lawyer after the two Myers brothers in Georgetown, and he principally practiced in Camden.
Richard, I think the other part of this story is a lot of these guys have military careers. In other words, Moise is a military guy, and Chapman Levy.
He's a colonel. He's a retired colonel from 1812.
So, they don't fit these stereotypes that people like to think of Jewish lawyers, really.
Let's talk about Franklin Moses Sr., Robert.
Yeah. Now, Franklin Moses Sr. is really, this is a very complicated story. He's the son of Meyer Moses, who is a very successful businessman in Charleston, who was elected to the South Carolina House in 1810.
I think he's like the first, once South Carolina becomes a state, I think he's the first Jewish House member, his father.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And so Richard and I have been trying to piece this together because part of the problem is there weren't any law schools back then. So the only way you could be a lawyer would be to read law in somebody's office. And so these lawyers we're talking about had to be able to get introduced to lawyers who were respected, where they could read law and then be admitted to the bar. Franklin Moses studies with the greatest South Carolina of all times, James L. Pettigrew. And James L. Pettigrew is, the law school used to be named the Pettigrew School of Law. And Pettigrew opposed secession. And of course, his witticism has come down, and y'all have probably read it at some point over the years. He said, South Carolina is too small for a republic and too large for a lunatic asylum. And in any event, despite his having opposed secession, Pettigrew was beloved by the bar. So how is it that the Jewish son of a Jewish father gets to study law with Pettigrew? And so Rich and I came to the conclusion, knowing lawyers as we do, probably Pettigrew was Moses Myers' lawyer. He's probably a good client. So, you have to have connection, unfortunately. And so Franklin Moses starts out, he is the very, symbol of the establishment. And he practices law in Sumter with his brother Montgomery Moses. He opposes secession during the Nullification Convention. And, a lot of these Jewish lawyers mostly oppose secession, but some of them are pro-nullification. He's elected to the South Carolina Senate from Sumter in 1841. So Richard, was he serving at the same time as Chapman Levy?
He wasn't, but he was at the same time of MC Mordecai from Charleston.
Right, MC. Right. So you have two Jewish senators when Mordecai was he was not a lawyer, but he was the senator from Charleston. Anyway, he's in the South Carolina Senate, and he is the chair of the Judiciary Committee. Now, I mean, the General Assembly is not known for radical and revolutionary behavior. So if you're the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, you're really a member of the established order, and you are, you're not a radical, or you're certainly not a free thinker. I mean, you're somebody that is going to be going along with the program.
And you're not outside the mainstream as a Jew, right?
He never was. So, but when the Civil War comes, and the war is over, in 1865, Moses is elected state circuit judge by the General Assembly, but Reconstruction goes through a lot of different phases. And so this is the phase where Andrew Johnson has got control, and white voters who are not really Confederates can vote. So the General Assembly at that point, Richard, is it majority black, or is it?
No, it has no blacks in it. They're not voting yet. This is a unionist white General Assembly.
Right. So it wouldn't be surprising that Moses would be elected circuit judge because he'd been chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and he was somebody that the white establishment, or even the white unionists, would trust. But then what happens is, he's later elected Chief Justice of the South Carolina Supreme Court in 1868 by the Reconstruction General Assembly, and reelected unanimously in 1874. Now, the problem here is, of course, that during Reconstruction, the General Assembly, what is the House majority black?
Majority black and significant numbers of African Americans in the Senate. Yeah.
Right. So of course, to the great majority of white people in South Carolina, he was now seen as aligning himself with the Reconstruction regime.
Plus, he taught in the law. He was the professor at the law school when the law school was founded, which had 21 African American graduates. It was the first public law school in America to admit African Americans. And he was teaching them. They didn't really have a law school. They would be in his chambers in the Supreme Court, and he would be socializing. He engaged with them. I mean, you have to have some confidence, some belief in the idea of political equality to do that. And there he is. He's teaching these students.
Well, Richard, furthermore, he served as chief with the first African-American member of the South Carolina's highest court, Jonathan Jasper Wright, who came from Pennsylvania to South Carolina to teach at a freedman school, and was ultimately elected to the legislature and elected to the Supreme Court. And Moses welcomed him to the Supreme Court.
Shook his hand when he arrived, made a big
right.
show of shaking his hand when he joined the court.
Yeah. So we really don't know. I don't think there's a biography of him. And so we don't know what he was thinking. Was he thinking, he could be a bridge between the races, that he could move things forward in a progressive way? Was he what was he thinking? Unfortunately, what makes the story even more complicated is that he marries a woman who is not Jewish and raises a son, Franklin Moses Jr., who, unfortunately, all the stereotypes that you've learned about Reconstruction, many of which have been exploded by recent scholars. Unfortunately, Franklin Moses Jr. was also known as the robber baron.
Robber governor.
The robber governor. So
and the Jews would call him a Gonoff.
Yeah, so the Jews didn't claim him. The Jews said he was raised as a Christian. The Moses family and Sumner changed their name from Moses to Harvey. They didn't want to have anything to do with him. He really was a bad guy. I mean,
but his father was not. And,
but his father
has been overlooked. And
right,
you're right, Rob. I mean, and he then, towards the end of his life, he gets very ill and dies. He apparently has now, towards the end of his life, he's sort of in bed with the Redeemers, the Wade Hampton crowd. So he has gone from a pre-Civil War, anti-nullification, but part of the establishment, to an Andrew Johnson Reconstruction white unionist, to an African-American allied group of Republicans, and now to the Redeemers, all in one lifetime, one person.
Yeah, I mean, and so on his death, the News and Courier lamented his death and said, "It is pleasantest to know that they thought he was going to vote in favor of Wade Hampton. The act that would have blotted out the past, he was not, in God's providence, allowed to perform. From the heights, like the Hebrew lawgiver, he might look down upon the land where reigned plenteousness and peace, but he had not kept the faith, and in the flesh he might not enter in." Now, for those of you who are not knowledgeable about Jewish theology, we're talking about the actual Moses who led the people out of Egypt, but was not allowed to enter into the promised land because of some, God wouldn't let him enter in. So everybody named Moses in South Carolina at one time or another, there's some mention of the Hebrew lawgiver, that people just can't resist it. So he's really a complex.
He's a chameleon. He is,
Yeah, he's a chameleon.
and that's one of the things they talk about. A lot of these Jews, these Sephardic and German Jews, I think he's Sephardic. They're the great chameleons. And, when later the Eastern European Jews arrived and were still sort of wearing shtetl clothes and so on, they were horrified because they were like assimilated and assimilating. And, but he is the first Jewish Chief Justice in America. And we have another Jewish Chief Justice we'll talk about next month, which is Chief Justice Toll's former colleague Julius Bubba Ness.
Bubba Ness.
Yeah, I mean, you can't make it up. I mean, it's really,
they're
it's
complex
really,
characters. Yeah.
Robert, talk to us about Edwin Warren Moise. He is an interesting character.
Yeah. Edwin Warren Moise, was, he went off to actually live and with another Jewish Confederate, Raphael J. Moses,
Yes.
who was from Charleston, and we went to Columbus. Edwin Warren Moise formed a unit, a cavalry unit of the Confederate Army called the Moise Rangers. As far as I can tell, it's the only official company named for a Jew in the Confederacy. So we know where Edwin Warren Moise was coming from. And he had a very illustrious career in the Confederate Army and served, with Wade Hampton. So when the war is over, he returns to Columbus, but there was nothing for him there. So he moves to Sumter, South Carolina.
But he did read law with his uncle,
read
Raphael Moses.
He read law and he became a lawyer. And then he arrived, Harold Moise wrote, riding a wounded horse, and paid the first month's board for his family of a wife and 5 children from the sale of that horse. That's when he arrived in Sumter. Well, he built a very large law practice and was very charismatic, was a very powerful speaker, a very powerful, energetic man. Remember, he rises to the rank of captain under Hampton. He's a cavalry officer. And then, of course, in the 1876 election, he's the head of the Red Shirts and then runs for adjutant general. So he is the adjutant general of South Carolina.
He's a statewide office. It's a statewide office.
Yeah, statewide office. So he's really quite a man. He was so involved with Sumter, and they loved him so much that he represented the Episcopal Church as their lawyer, and they invited him to become an honorary member of the vestry, which he had to decline.
He said, "Because I'm an Israelite."
Yeah. So he goes on to practice law and becomes really a major figure in Reconstruction South Carolina. Now, the other thing that's interesting that I would like to mention is there's another Edwin Warren Moise, who's I'm sure related, who moves to New Orleans, and you know, what's funny about some of these Jewish lawyers is we got Edwin Warren Moise in South Carolina. We have another Edwin Warren Moise in New Orleans from South Carolina, who's the federal district judge and then a Confederate judge. And then we have Judah Benjamin, who we'll talk about in a minute. And then we have Henry Hyams, and these are all South Carolina Jews. So the William Howard Russell, the author of, was a writer for the London Times. This is what he said about Louisiana at the time of the Civil War. He says, "It is a strange country indeed. One of the evils which afflicts Louisianians, they say, is the preponderance and influence of South Carolinian Jews."
And I mean,
Not
when you're
just
talking
Jews,
about who they're,
but-
first of all, Judah Benjamin is the U.S. Senator.
U.S. Senator.
Henry Hyams is the Lieutenant Governor, and
Right.
Edwin Warren Moise is the Speaker of the House.
Right, right.
All from South Carolina.
All from South Carolina. So it's not just bad enough that they had Jews who were running things with South Carolinian Jews and Jews generally. And then he says, such as Moise, Mordecai, Joseph, and Judah Benjamin. Anyway, so and it is kind of interesting because a number of these lawyers do go west. I mean, they seek their fortune in other places. So,
Let's
And
move
that
over
leads
to-
me-
yeah, let's do. We got images of Judah Benjamin and Philip Phillips. They're both
Yeah.
interesting
so
characters.
so where's Judah?
There's Judah Benjamin. Yeah.
Yeah, well, of course, Judah Benjamin is not a lawyer in Charleston, but he is born and raised on King Street. And his father was a member of the Reformed Society of Israelites. He's a Sephardic Jew from the West Indies, goes to Yale, busts out, goes to New Orleans, and really becomes one of the most outstanding lawyers in Louisiana. He spoke 3 languages. He did international and commercial law. He was actually asked to be on the United States Supreme Court, which he refused. He was too busy with his law practice. He didn't want to bother with being on the U.S. Supreme Court. And then, of course, he has this career as Jefferson Davis's sort of right-hand man, Secretary of State, Secretary of War, Attorney General of the Confederacy. And then he leaves, he escapes and goes to London, where he becomes one of the most famous international lawyers in England, is highly respected. So in terms of being a Jewish lawyer from South Carolina, when he
writes a book called Benjamin on Sales that
Right,
is a
which was in
classic
print.
for
Right.
100 years. I mean, it goes through many editions, but he had compared the Napoleonic law from Louisiana, the English law, and the French law, and
Right.
then he goes to London, and he becomes the greatest litigator in London after
Right.
the Civil War. I mean, it's kind of amazing.
Well, what's so charming about it is he applies to the bar in England, and they ask him, about himself. He says his father was a merchant in Charleston, South Carolina. That's on his application.
Aren't we all?
So our next slide is,
Jesus.
now Philip Phillips is really a truly fascinating guy. He's born in Charleston in 1807, the son of a German Jewish immigrant, Aaron Phillips, who I think was also a lawyer. His mother, Caroline Lazarus, whose father, I just have to say this, Richard, her father, so Philip Phillips's grandfather, was Mark Lazarus, who was at Fort Sumter with William Moultrie.
Revolutionary War.
At least 2 Jewish soldiers that we know who were there. So Philip Phillips has a connection to that. He studies under Isaac Harvey. He read law. Again, he must have come from a prominent family because he read law with an eminent Charleston lawyer, John Gadsden, who had been the U.S. District Attorney. And at the age of 22, he becomes a successful lawyer. He was a member of the Reformed Society of Israelites. He marries Eugenia Phillips, Eugenia Levy, whose father was also president of Beth Elohim. When Phillips joined the bar, he relocated to Cheraw, South Carolina, where he rode the circuit. In the nullification crisis, he was a unionist. And then he picks up and moves to Mobile, Alabama. Once again, like Chapman Levy, South Carolina is kind of not the place to be, I guess, in the 1830s and 40s. and he goes to make his fortune in Mobile, Alabama, where he is elected to Congress. He's a very successful attorney. He was one of the most successful appellate lawyers. He appeared before the Supreme Court of the United States. And when he was elected to Congress, he's sitting in the patent office with John Breckinridge and Stephen Douglas writing the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So, you know, I mean, these are just.
But his post-Congress career, he argues 400 cases before the U.S. Supreme Court.
Right. Yeah. So he's really a remarkable person. His wife was sort of crazy. She was a real radical Confederate. He was sort of opposed to the whole thing. He was trying to keep her quiet down in New Orleans, but that never worked. That's a whole nother story. But the point here is just an extremely talented, nationally known lawyer who's trained, who was born and raised at the Temple, and then, becomes a lawyer, becomes really a nationally renowned.
Well, after the Civil War, we all know, we've discussed this in previous webcasts, just how much the state suffered as a consequence of the Civil War. And many of the early Jews in Charleston, Columbia, elsewhere left. I mean, the state was economically devastated. Some had left before, like Chapman Levy and Philip Phillips. But after the war, the Jewish community really decreased significantly. But then these Eastern European and Russian Jews began arriving in the 1880s, and a number of them end up coming south because there's an opportunity there. Rachel, let's talk about your husband's grandfather, Wendell Levi.
Yeah. So Wendell Levi Sr. was born in Sumter. He was the reluctant lawyer. He was a graduate of the College of Charleston, where he lettered in 3 sports: basketball, baseball, and track. They knew him as Mighty Levi. Graduated in 1912. He loved baseball, and as family lore goes, the Chicago Cubs were trying to recruit him, but his mother said, absolutely not. You will go to law school. And he went to the University of Chicago Law School. He had an uncle in Chicago who was a great mentor to him. And he graduated University of Chicago Law in 1915. And then, of course, World War I came along, and he served as the head of the Pigeon Corps. And there's a photo that you see of the young man in his uniform. And at the bottom of that, it's inscribed somewhere in France. Because of his Pigeon Corps experience, became fascinated with pigeons. And he became really and truly internationally known as the Pigeon Man. He wrote several books, which are still in publication today. And it's amazing. There is an enormous pigeon world internationally now. I've done some research on this. All of his papers and a lot of what he has about pigeons is at the College of Charleston. They have all of his papers. He founded the Palmetto Pigeon Plant with Harold Moise in 1923, which is still in existence today. They are known for squab. They ship squab around the world, as well as poussin. And and he was a lawyer. He was a very successful lawyer. He founded Levi Wittenberg in Sumter with his friend Phil Wittenberg. They had many lawyers join them. The firm is still in existence today. As a matter of fact, several of our friends, Jack Swirling among them, that was Jack Swirling. Any of you from Columbia may know Jack. His first job was with that firm in Sumter.
Yeah, Mr. Levi was 93 years old when Jack went there, and he was still practicing.
Right. So he would go, he'd practice in the morning, he'd come home, have lunch, take a nap, and then spend the afternoon at the pigeon plant. So he was really one of these. Oh, and he also had a love of camellias. He had an extensive garden, and he was, I think he was a judge with camellia shows as well. So to me, he sounds like this Renaissance man is how I've always referred to him, as one of these bigger than life figures.
Mentioning bigger than life, we got very interested in these early women attorneys. We were trying to find out more about the earliest women attorneys. I believe 1918 is when we have our first woman attorney, Ms. Perry, is that right?
Yes, 1918, the first admitted was Miss Jim Perry, James Y. Perry of Greenville. But among the very earliest lawyers are people like Hannah Axelman, whose portrait appears in the Charleston courthouse. I'm sure that Robert Rosen and his family had a lot to do with the belated but very well-deserved recognition of Hannah Axelman. You can see on the slideshow that Rachel's presenting, she was a graduate of NYU Law School and was the wife of Rabbi Axelman, and was licensed in Maryland. They then came to Charleston, and she was an attorney here for a good long time after she practiced in Maryland. They came here because her husband was given a congregation here that of which he became the rabbi. But she practiced at home. She had a sign out in front of her house, lawyer, and she had an extremely active law practice, primarily what we would call office practice, probate, wills, deeds, property matters. But that was the heart and soul. That was the bread and butter of a lawyer's practice when Ms. Axelman began. And to think that with women being such a minority in the practice of law in South Carolina, that a Jewish woman could make her way and be an independent practitioner and successful one in a rather active legal community of Charleston.
But Gene, 11 years before, we have Evelyn Marcus. Talk about her. She is a fascinating figure.
Well, she is the first Jewish woman to be admitted to practice law in South Carolina very shortly after the first of us was admitted in this state. And she worked in the probate courts in Orangeburg County for quite some time before she finally decided to read for the law, which was the most common way of being educated about the law. Going to law school was a luxury for a lot of people. And of course, back in Ms. Marcus's day, women weren't admitted to law school at the University of South Carolina. So she read the law and then took the bar exam, passed it with flying colors, and practiced law in Orangeburg on probate and real estate work for many years. But here's the real amazing thing. Ms. Marcus was deaf. She had a great affinity for reading lips, and she therefore was able to make her way very successfully in the practice of law. She is described as an imposing personality, like a lot of people who are hard of hearing, as Richard and Robert know I am. Even with hearing aids, kind of have a hard time hearing, and it's a loss, a deficit I suffered in my 30s. But you hear your own voice, and if your hearing is impaired, you generally do speak in a stronger tone. And for someone who is profoundly deaf, as Ms. Marcus was, it really is pretty amazing that she was able to speak very clearly and be able to be understood. You have probably known, as I have, a lot of people who either have a total hearing deficit or a severe hearing deficit, and many speak in a way that isn't very distinct. Ms. Marcus was not one of those people.
What I love about her, Gene, is, she sits there working in the probate court. She's telling all the men how to do it. And after some point, she just says, I'm smarter than they are.
Exactly. And, the wonderful part about it was that she had such ability that she was accepted because she could do the work better than the folks with whom she was colleagues. She starts off as a stenographer, then she's kind of a clerk in the probate office, and she knows they're all coming to her in that whole general area where probate and title work is the key to an agricultural community and the setting up of titles and the passing along of property. And she's the go-to way before she has a law license.
And then when she practices, she's like the other lawyers bring her their probate work because administering trust and estates is pretty complicated.
Exactly. And she, even with this very profound hearing thing, kind of in front of her, she is an extremely successful probate practitioner. Pretty amazing.
Now I want to tell you, Rachel has chased an image of Evelyn Marcus unsuccessfully. And she's called family members and chased it. And we are having a call for a picture of Evelyn Marcus. We do not want the first Jewish woman attorney of South Carolina to be distinguished only by an article from the Orangeburg newspaper. We want her image. So anyone out there, surely some family wedding or something. She was active in, she's very close with her family in Orangeburg. Certainly a family wedding or something. We want an image, and Rachel is on the hunt. If you let her know, she will chase it down. She is called, I think she knows the entire Marcus family tree now.
Richard, I want to go back. Richard.
Yes.
I want to go back to Hannah Axelman for a minute. Benjamin Axelman was the rabbi of Bris Shalom and Beth Israel from 1927 until 1943. Now, I find this to be extremely interesting. These are Orthodox congregations. These are Orthodox believing Jews. Now, how does the wife of the rabbi get out of the house and become a lawyer? I think these stories, how Jewish people became lawyers, how they made their way. And then, this story of an Orthodox wife of a rabbi, to me, it's more, I have a particular interest in it because Rabbi Axelman was the rabbi who presided over my father's bar mitzvah at Brit Shalom. Well,
Rabbi Axelman was originally in law school and at Fordham, and he decided to go to rabbinical school, and people would say to him, "Why is your wife a lawyer?" And he said, "Well, I wanted to be a lawyer, so I married one."
I just wondered what the congregation thought about it.
I'm sure they were mystified, but that's okay. Let's talk about Judy Littman, if we can. Judy Lindau Littman. Gene, let's talk about her. She was like the only, you can see this wonderful picture. She's the only woman in her class in 1939.
And isn't this a wonderful picture of Judy, who many of us in this community knew well? She was a force of nature and practiced actively well after she got her law license. She graduated from law school in 1939, and to begin with, much of what she did in the practice of law related to her family's businesses. And she kind of became the go-to for very sophisticated corporate transactions with her own family businesses. But she then began a private practice. She was licensed for over 70 years before she died. She was an enormously influential lawyer here in Columbia because she really mentored women. And there were so few of us, even when I graduated from law school in 1968, and there weren't but 40 licensed lawyers in the entire state of South Carolina. And out of those 40, not but 10 actively practiced law in 1968. There were still plenty of law schools in the country that did not admit women until the ABA finally said, we're not going to continue to license you as a law school. Notre Dame was one of them, unless you admit women. So Judy was a real trailblazer, and it's interesting, Richard, I'm sure, is going to talk about how Jews began to have such an impact as lawyers in the University of South Carolina Law School, when, like Catholics, which is what I am, there was such a small percentage of the population of South Carolina, and yet Jews came to law school in numbers that far exceeded their presence in the population, and many of them did not come from an educated background. They weren't Sephardic Jews, and they were people from the Eastern European countries, generally first generation, and they had an enormous impact on our bar, and were admitted in numbers that, when you look at them, are really pretty surprising. Judy was in that mix of lawyers and was one of the early ones. We'll talk about another, Coleman Carish, who was kind of probably the huge influence from the 20s on law students in general, and certainly Jewish lawyers. But Judy comes into the environment where by gender and by religion, she is very much in a minority, and takes it upon herself to not only help her family become very successful in business. Mr. Lindau, who was her last husband, was very successful in the broadcast industry in South Carolina and in Columbia. But she, in that environment, is able to be successful and influence the careers of other women like myself.
Well, the story with Judy was that she raised her two brilliant daughters, and then she decides to go practice law, and she goes into a law office just to get her feet a little wet, and the lawyer she's practicing with becomes ill and dies, and she's got a full law practice right from the start, and she just does a beautiful job and she was just a very respected lawyer in Columbia.
Yeah, he willed her his practice. And she had been there a very short period of time. You can imagine what a daunting prospect that was, but she was pretty sophisticated about how she approached the law as a business.
Well, she's something. Well, you mentioned Gene Coleman Carish. He graduates from the law school in 1920s. His father's the rabbi at Beth Shalom in Columbia. He's a prominent member of the Jewish community of Columbia. And then he joins the faculty in the 1930s, and he teaches multiple generations of law schools over 40 years. And talk to him about his influence just at the law school and his towering presence at the law school.
Well, because Coleman, the law school library is named for him quite justifiably. He was probably the scholar at the University of South Carolina Law School from the time he joined the faculty. He graduated from law school in 1923. He practiced law with Senator James Hammond, quite a segregationist, and it's just a very improbable union that this Jewish lawyer teamed up with a big presence in the Columbia community, business-wise and law-wise. But in fact, the school here is named for Senator Hammond, was a prominent senator. But Coleman Carish was so brilliant that in this area of law, again, which was kind of the body and soul of law, particularly for the socially prominent lawyers of the time, dealing with trusts and estates and the transmission of property, was kind of the heart and soul of a big practice. Coleman Carish becomes the man that everyone looks at. By the time he came to the law school faculty in the 30s, he had began to, even while he was in practice with Senator Hammond, achieve a reputation around the state as an expert in wills and trusts and estates and probate. After he came to the faculty, he was really able to turn his talents much more nationally. Coleman was very interested in having more uniform approach throughout the states to this very important area of the law that was his specialty, wills and estates and trusts. And he became involved with the National Uniform Code Commissioners effort in this country early on to get model laws adopted state by state to regulate areas of the practice so that there would be much more ability to transmit ideas and business and law from state to state, and not have each state standing as an isolated entity. He ultimately became the Uniform Laws Commissioner for the state of South Carolina. He was a prominent member of the American Law Institute, which is the national group now that develops uniform laws for the states in so many different areas. So this man was an enormously prominent national figure in his field from small University of South Carolina. But the other thing he had was an enormous influence on young lawyers. And I believe, and Richard will amplify on this with some of the research he's done about the surprising entry in numbers of Jews into the legal community of South Carolina. But both he and I believe that the combination of Coleman Carish as such a towering and respected intellectual figure at that law school, and the fact that the University of South Carolina did not have quotas based on religion, which many, many institutions of higher education did in this country, proved to be an enormous stimulus of interest by Jews in South Carolina in going to this law school. You might want to amplify on that a little bit, because I think
Yeah, I mean,
Coleman story.
right, the idea that the rabbi's son is the most prominent person at the law school, this sort of sends a message to aspiring, Jewish law students that this is a welcome mat. And what Gene was talking about was that at the time of let's say 1950, the state's population was 0.3% Jewish, 0.3%. So the period between 1945 and 1954, there should have been, if you took all the graduates of the law school, there should have been 2 Jewish graduates. Well, there were 22 Jewish graduates, a factor of 10 times. Plus you had Jews going to other law schools. So in Charleston in 1960, now we're going to talk a lot about this in July about these post-World War II Jewish attorneys. Charleston, nearly 20% of the bar is Jewish in a state that, is less than 1% Jewish. And Coleman Carish is a huge influence. Robert, he taught you and your daddy, right?
Yeah, I was going to say, Coleman Carish was a professor who taught my father and me. So his career was, and he had quite a dry wit. You didn't want to make a mistake in his class.
Well, he was a kind of intimidating figure. Tell him about the time you disappeared
Yeah,
from
so
law school.
I wasn't maybe the world's greatest law student, and I was dating this girl in New York, and I decided to take a week off and go to New York. And this is how small the law school was. I got back and I came back to Professor Carish's class, and he looks up from the lecture and he goes, "Well, Mr. Rosen, how was New York?" And, so he was.
I'm sure he did not regard you as the same student as Morris was.
I think he thought my father might have been a better student.
But
he was a big influence.
Well, Professor Carish and his wife Alice, who was a part of that team, she was also a wonderfully engaging person with students at the law school. But each one of them kind of knew who was different and who needed a hand to lift them a little bit into the mainstream of the law school community. Both Mrs. Carish and Professor Carish were quite kind to me when I first got there and really encouraging. He was such an intimidating presence in the classroom that I wouldn't have thought of approaching him, but he approached me and said, "Gene, I want to talk to you for a minute. I'm understanding you're very able, and there's a lot riding for women in the future on your succeeding. And Alice and I want to see what we can do to help you succeed. It's important." Now, how about that? Pick out a young woman and make that kind of projection to her.
Made you believe you could be somebody.
Yes.
Well, Lily, do we have any questions from our audience?
We have one in particular from Robin out of Augusta asking if y'all are familiar with Jacob and Isaac Moise, who moved to Augusta in 1825. And he may have lived in North Augusta, but they may have lived in North Augusta prior to coming to Augusta. Robin, are they those attorneys?
I don't know. I just know the name of the family.
Yeah, all I can say is that Moises are like kudzu. They're everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a history of the Moise family. I wish Anita Rosenberg was on this program. She could answer some of these questions.
And I have to mention that there's a shout out to Justice Toll from Susan Rosen. Susan, why don't you say out loud what you put in the chat? I thought it was so appropriate.
Susan's got to turn her mic on.
Yeah, I'm turning everything on.
Yeah.
Can you see me and hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So Chief Justice Toll, I came here in 1983, and so I'm one of the old women lawyers, and she was a role model for all of us. And she also, at every step of the way, reached down and pulled women up. She helped every woman lawyer that ever needed help, that ever asked her. And she is so incredible. And I posted that because I am so appreciative of what she has done, not just, I mean, for the whole bar, because she's really one of the premier lawyers of our time, but she also, for women lawyers, was an incredible role model and also helped people, women lawyers, every step of the way. So I did want to say that. Yeah.
Well,
That's
it was-
how compliments coming from as good a lawyer as Susan Rosen is. So all I got to tell you.
Well, it's all true. It's all true. And I mean, I've been here a long time, and there's never been another woman lawyer that has achieved what you have achieved, and also always helped the other women lawyers. And I think that is an amazing accomplishment. And I think
The good news is the crowd coming along behind both of us, Susan, will make the world forget us pretty quick. We've got so many bright women lawyers now, it's just absolutely astounding. We in the young, as we age out and the new crowd comes in, we are approaching in the state of South Carolina 35% women lawyers at our bar. And from the thing I described in 1968, that's pretty darn amazing.
Well, and the law school classes are more than half women. And so in a progression of time, they will be half the bar, if not more.
And Richard and Robert, I know Richard in particular has focused in on this. Do those big numbers of Jews who decide to go into the legal profession continue in this state? It's an
Yes.
observation that they do.
Yes.
That's another thing that, again, if you build that platform and that foundation of acceptance in a very real sort of sense, not in some sort of artificial sense, then you start to build a community that has a nice, strong, significant representation of a group who is on the low end of diversity to start with. And the Jews are certainly a good example of that in the legal profession in the state.
Well, and what's so interesting about these, and we'll get into this in July, is that the post-World War II, those Jewish kids who come back as veterans and on the GI Bill, they come to USC Law School. They are first-generation Americans. They are the children of immigrants. And their fathers, I joked about, weren't we all merchants? Yes, they were all merchants, and their parents were merchants. Robert, Morris Rosen's father was a merchant. My father was a merchant. And so these first generation Americans become lawyers. You can just imagine. I mean, my friend Peter Shahid, who's comes from Lebanese immigrants, he says, the USC Law School had an imperfect history on race, but it was a field of opportunity for new Americans.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that Rich and I have learned is that I think that it looks to us like there's sort of a correlation between the lawyers and the merchants. In other words, the Jewish merchants were willing to peddle, they were willing to go out in the country, they were willing to open up stores, they were willing to serve African Americans, poor people. They were willing to do a lot of things that maybe other people weren't. And I think that the Jewish lawyers, in a way, is somewhat analogous. In other words, they didn't get out of law school and go get big jobs in big corporate firms. I mean, you know, the white shoe law firms weren't hiring Jewish lawyers. And so there was an opportunity for them to go into the plaintiff's practice, the criminal practice, kind of representing, you know, marginalized people and people of all different socioeconomic backgrounds. So I think it's kind of interesting how the merchant idea and the law idea seem to be somewhat related.
They went where the opportunity was.
Right.
And, you know, even to this day, Jews are, you know, areas of personal injury law and family law and small, you know, small business law and all of that, things that the big law firms would have looked down on. The Jews did it, and they built great lives doing it. And, you know, one of the things we're going to talk about in July is we're going to try to compare the sort of South Carolina experience to the national experience. Robert, you alluded to this, of these white shoe law firms not employing Jews. And we're going to have as our guest Fred Lawrence, who is the former dean of the George Washington Law School. And then he was the president of Brandeis. He's now the CEO of Phi Beta Kappa. And he's very interested in this whole issue of the history of Jewish lawyering. And he's going to join us and talk about the experiences nationally, and it will help correlate with our experience in South Carolina. That's coming in July. And I think it's just this whole post-World War II explosion. You know, the law practice itself explodes after World War II. It's not just the Jews. And it's not just that the Jews, you know, in South Carolina are going, I mean, 60% of the bar in New York in 1960 was Jewish. I mean, it had come to be seen, Robert. You may not have seen it in the earlier era, but it was like medicine, a desired, you know, profession for
my
Jews.
son, the lawyer, and my son, the doctor. Yeah.
Right. And you just remember, you've got, here you have in the early part of the 20th century, you have Benjamin Cardozo, you have Louis Brandeis and Felix Frankfurter on the US Supreme Court. I mean, suddenly, hey, you know, that's a profession worthy of attention, an opportunity.
Yeah.
So with that, I think we all have to agree that today's discussion has been eye-opening with the wealth of information on our Jewish lawyers. We will pick up this discussion on July 25th, which will focus on the post-World War II generation of Jewish attorneys who were mostly veterans and first-generation Americans. This concludes our program tonight, and we look forward to seeing you on Sunday Conversations, July 25th. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Justice Hall.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Robert. Thank you, Richard.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Phil. And thank you, Rachel. What an honor to be with all of you on this wonderful program.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Toll.